So what I'll do is I shall start with a bit of a history lesson. Now, you've seen, and you may be confused by the term that we're talking about, which is bias. Yeah, and the way I put it is bias is a small word, but it is a big problem. And what do I mean by bias? I'll explain. So the history lesson, first of all, key thing here is that what you're seeing on your screen on the left-hand side is a small diagram or schematic of an aircraft. This goes back to World War II. And during World War II, one of the key things that happened was that data was massively important. And the diagram, the little red dots that you actually see on the screens on that aircraft are mapping of flak and damage to the aircraft. So either from anti-aircraft fire, from other aircrafts, etc., or from explosions, those types of things. So what they used to do was they used to take a detailed map of every aircraft to see exactly where that damage happened. And pretty much what they would do is where those dots occurred, think, right, we need more armor, we need more protection, we need to put the protection around that particular place. And that was all intended to improve the survivability rating of that aircraft. Some went down quite frequently, etc. But the point is that as they were adding more armor and doing all these things, that survivability rate wasn't changing. And it's then that there was a young Hungarian gentleman called Abraham Wald. Now, Abraham Wald was a mathematician and statistician, and apparently has contributed to something called decision theory. But what Abraham Wald did is he looked at the problem in reverse, in that there was data that was available to people. The data that people were looking at was the data that said something happened here. But he was saying, actually, the important data was the stuff that was missing. This is where we'd taken and done and acted on what we knew. But once they'd gone back and looked at it again, actually, the bit that was really important was the bits that weren't there. So his instruction to the engineers and those designed to fit the armor to the aircraft had taken a look and said, look, actually, what we do need to do is to start fitting the armor in the places where we're not seeing any data. And that actually dramatically had a huge effect on the survivability rating of those aircraft. And that phenomenon, pardon my French, is actually known as survivorship bias. And there are theses around these whole things, etc., etc. But the point is that the unknown data, or the data that appeared to be missing, was the bit that was super important. That was the bit that actually had the key to survivability. And once they'd reinforced those aircraft, massive increase in the survivability rate of the aircraft. So I could hear you say, so what's that actually got to do with the problems that we're facing today? Well, if we fast forward to today, we have a different form of bias. And for those of you who are involved in customer satisfaction or customer effort scores and NPS and various other things, typically you're asking people to volunteer to respond to a particular survey. And one of the things that you do have here is a similar kind of bias that is a problem. And this is called volunteer bias. So volunteer bias is kind of important because the key thing that happens with volunteer bias is that from a person's perspective, or from a personal perspective, people tend to be polarized in their responses. If something either very good happens to you or very bad happens to you, you're motivated. If something that you just kind of expect to happen just happens, and it's just a normal day and do various other things, you have no incentive or motivation to respond. And the problem is that, so the good responders and the bad responders, whether you're at the bottom of the chart or the top of the chart, have a tendency to skew the data that you're looking at and to skew the responses. So that middle bit, that sort of orange bit in the center, is super important, because that starts to tell you the real views, the real insights about what people are seeing, what people are feeling. And this goes to many, many different places, because that data gap from an analysis perspective is absolutely huge. Because given that really how people respond and what they respond with is based on emotion. It's important for us to understand, but also the bits that have no emotion, or that people can't be bothered, or you're asking at a different time, because the time of when a question is asked, if it's a post-call survey, if it happens immediately after the call, or if it happens 5 minutes after the call because you've actually sent them an email about that. The point is they've lost incentive at that point. The interaction that you have, and that live interaction, so that chat, that voice, that piece that you have with that person, is where the real data is held in terms of what they actually felt and what they actually thought. And it's not them telling you, this is actually looking at what they said, what they did, and how they behaved. So how do or can surveys avoid bias? Well, it's very difficult to do, actually. But the point is, if you look at, you know, as we spoke about NPS and CSAT and CES, the point is that these things are effectively historical. And they're only historical by a few minutes, but they are historical nonetheless. And more importantly, they're also guided. So the questions you're asking, the responses you're getting, are responses to your specific question. If there are outliers or there are other things that have happened, and you may have the free-form text or the ability to put some free-form text into a response or to verbalize that response, but typically, again, because there's no automation or no process for that, the issue happens that actually you get a response to what you've asked. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy to a certain extent, in that I think this is good or I think this is bad. But the time delay is crucial, because that time delay does make a huge difference to what sort of an answer you get. So in terms of where things are going, yes, surveys, you know, are great for known things, but what they're not good at, what they're really not good at, is unknown things, what we call the unknown unknowns. If there are things that you have no knowledge about in your questioning, you're not going to capture it, because if you don't ask, you don't get. And those things may be pretty urgent issues. Those things may be absolutely critical to your business and may be costing you significant amounts of money in terms of servicing something that you don't know about. If we look at the other side of the coin from an agent perspective, in terms of quality, that too is super important, because not only are you asking how did you get on, did you get everything you wanted, etc., but you also need to know from an agent quality perspective that those things have been serviced in a particular way. So for us, that whole point is that, you know, yes, there are missed insights. Those missed insights means there are missed opportunities, and those missed opportunities mean there are missed outcomes. And that's a big thing. That's a really big thing.